Welcome, everyone. My name is Jill Greenwood. I'm the Erik and Jane Nord Family Curator of Education at the Allen Memorial Art Museum. And I'm going to introduce today's moderator and then our speaker. So Mary Van Noordhoek, today's moderator, is Professor Emeritus of English and Canadian Studies at the University of Akron. She holds a PhD degree in English from Case Western Reserve University, and her primary research and publications were on novels of Margaret Atwood and other notable Canadian writers. As chair of the lifelong learning program at Kendal at Oberlin, she and her committee work to bring scholars at Oberlin College and elsewhere to present short courses on various topics for Kendal residents. And thanks to Zoom, those of you tuned in locally and from afar. She is also a lifetime member of the Allen's Volunteer Guild. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Erik Inglis from the Oberlin class of 1989 is the Mildred C. Professor of Art at Oberlin College, specializing in medieval art history in Europe and the Mediterranean. He is published on art from France and Flanders, particularly the 15th century court artist Jean Fouquet. His current research addresses the medieval art historical imagination. As of now, he's in the final days of a course on Albrecht Dürer that accompanies an exhibition of Allen's Dürer prints, co-curated with our former Director of Academic Programs, Hannah Wortha Kinney, excuse me. Professor Inglis also has taught at Oberlin since 1997. I have known Erik to be a supportive colleague who is deeply committed to Oberlin College and passionate about working with students. He labors tirelessly in the service of education, shared knowledge, and advising students to find their own career path in the visual arts. Thank you, Erik, for being here today. We are looking forward to this two-part webinar series on Albrecht Dürer. If you have not signed up for the second one, please go to the Allen Art Museum's website and you can sign up for the second webinar. I'm going to stop sharing now and we'll allow Erik to.
All right, thank you all for being here. It's great to see you. Thank you, Jill, for that introduction. Thank you also, Mary, for moderating. I would echo Jill in saying that to remind you that you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. I'll pause periodically during the talk to take your questions. I'd like to thank the Allen for the opportunity to have done this exhibition with Hannah Wortha Kinney. It's one of the great joys that I've had in the last several years at Oberlin. And the chance to teach the class with 30 students who've been passionate about Albrecht Dürer has been a phenomenal teaching opportunity for me that would only be possible at Oberlin. What I want to do in these two classes is, first of all, today really give an introduction to who Dürer is. I'm going to dwell in particular on some works from the Allen. So I'd remind you that the show in the Allen runs through January. So if you haven't seen it yet, you have a chance to see it. If you have seen it but want to come back and look after the talk today, I would very much encourage you to do so. And then next week, after this introduction today, we'll talk about Dürer as Dürer in the intersection with families, his own family and his depictions of family. So to start, and this in some ways gives a prelude for next week as well, Dürer lives from 1472 to 1528. So the 28 years on either side of 1500, dying at 56. He is the son of a goldsmith, Albrecht Dürer the Elder, whose self-portrait you see here on the left, who emigrated from Hungary to Nuremberg in the 1460s. Recognizing that Nuremberg, which was a frequent residence for the emperor, which was a wealthy commercial city, and was centrally located on trade routes, would be a great place for a goldsmith to set up. So Albrecht Dürer the Elder installs his goldsmith shop in Nuremberg. Albrecht Dürer the Younger, the artist we'll be talking about today, the subject of the show, is his third son, one of the only sons to live to adulthood, and starts training as a goldsmith, and then as a teenager tells his father, after a year or so of apprenticeship in his father's studio, he'd much rather become a painter. And he says that his father regretted this decision a bit because the time spent already serving as an apprentice, but allowed him to enter training with a painter named Michael Vogelmuth to train to be a painter. That Dürer was a precocious artist, we can see with his self-portrait here on the right from 1484, clearly imitating to some degree the pose and the style of his father, but also quite accomplished, especially given that he's 13 years old at the time he does this drawing. This drawing on the right also gives us another insight into Dürer. In addition to the self-portrait drawing, which shows him gazing off to the right, a little cap on his head and his long hair, which would be a pronounced feature of his self-portraiture, there's an inscription at the top, which he added much later, probably around 1520. That lets us know that he'd kept this drawing in his collection for 30 some years. And the inscription he adds around 1520 says, "This is a drawing I did of myself in 1484 when I was 13 years old." That inscription in some ways converts this from being a practice exercise to being the first of Dürer's self-portraits. It also shows us that Dürer very much was an artist who was, from the very beginning, invested in keeping the works he had made, and reflecting on the works he had made and his growth as an artist. And in today's talk, what I want to do in some ways is twofold. First, I want to think about that artistry, to some degree, how he trained as an artist, in particular, how he worked as an artist, and how he set out in many ways by the end of his life a program for others to become artists. So he thinks a great deal about the status of artists and what it takes to be a talented artist. And then I want to turn to the question of entrepreneurship, which is how Dürer made a living as an artist. One of the early conversations I had with a student in the gallery was a student, I think back in maybe the first week of September, first week of classes, saying how much they admired Dürer as an artist and they felt he had never sold out. And it struck me that that was a slightly anachronistic judgment, that if you had told Dürer, oh, you didn't sell out, in other words, you didn't give up your art for monetary gain, or you didn't shape your art to monetary gain, Dürer wouldn't have been able to recognize what that meant. Because Dürer, in a pre-Romantic age, working in the late 15th, early 16th century, very much saw his art making as, he would say, a divine gift, but also as a divine gift that it made perfect sense to put to use to earn money and make a living. And he winds up by the early 16th century making a very handsome living indeed. And so we'll talk about some of those strategies. I want to start, though, with this self-portrait of 1500. This is, depending on how you count, this is the third painted self-portrait that Dürer does. The most monumental and imposing of his self-portraits. It's now in Munich, and I'm showing you a photo of it installed on the left, just to give you some sense of the scale of this. Some of you may know that's my wife, Heather Galloway. Again, thanks to Oberlin, we were able to go to Germany last January as a study tour as I got ready for this class and the show. And I think it's always useful to see a painting when you're looking at it on a screen on Zoom, to see it installed in a gallery as well, to give you some sense of scale. This painting that Dürer executes in 1500, this self-portrait, has multiple facets that I want us to think about. In some ways, I'm cutting right to the chase with the self-portrait, because this shows Dürer with his highest self-image, in some sense, as an artist. It's got a prominent Latin inscription, written very elegantly in gold leaf. We see it to the right of his head, which says, to use Ashcroft's translation, I, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, was portraying myself thus in my own enduring colors at the age of 28 years. And there are a couple notable things here. First, that insistence on it as a self-portrait. The use of Latin, although Dürer was not particularly literate in Latin. He's doing an inscription here in Latin. We know that he had assistance from an important humanist at this point named Konrad Keltis, one of the leading humanists in Germany, who's helping him come up with an appropriate phrase. Keltis's assistance is also very clear in the potentially somewhat odd phrase, was portraying myself, Effingebam. in the Latin, and imperfect. So not I painted myself in the perfect tense, but was portraying myself as if we've caught him midstream, as if he's not quite finished. And that imperfect tense, was portraying myself, is actually a classical citation. Uh, Humanists like Conrad Keltis read about ancient artists like ancient painters like like Apelles, an ancient Roman painter, who apparently always signed his work in the imperfect. I was doing this to suggest this was the best I could do, but if I had worked further, it would be still even better. So this is very much a humanist trope that's showing us something about Dürer's learning through the assistance of this humanist advisor, Conrad Keltis. And the fact that he's got a scholarly advisor, even for a self-portrait, tells us a lot about Dürer's ambition and also his audience. In the same year that Dürer painted this self-portrait, Conrad Keltis wrote 3 epigrams on Dürer. And I'm giving you just part of the first of these epigrams. Albrecht, most renowned painter in German lands, where the city of Nuremberg lifts its head high to the stars. As another Phidias, a second Apelles, you come to us. And as those whom learned Greece admires for their educated hand. Neither Italy has seen your like, nor fickle France, and neither will anyone ever in the lands of Spain. And there are maybe 3 or 4 things to take from this inscription. First of all, the distinct pride in Dürer as a German painter from the city of Nuremberg comes across here. And so I think we can read this epigram back into Dürer's self-portrait, since these two are working closely at this point. Then there's the classical comparison. Keltis compares Dürer to another Phidias, the second Apelles. And these are ancient authors known primarily from the ancient artists known primarily from the ancient author Pliny, who's widely read throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And for an artist around 1500 to be compared to them puts us square in the middle of the Renaissance with the idea of a rebirth of classical antiquity. So Dürer, a contemporary artist from 1500, is being compared to the greatest artists of classical antiquity. And then there's the European-wide comparison that Keltis said, you're better than anyone in Italy or in France or in Spain. So very much a kind of note here of German nationalism as well, and pride in Dürer as a German artist. So that's what we can take in some sense from the Latin inscription and from Keltis's text. But there's another important comparison that Dürer invites us to make, not just to classical past, not just to contemporary artists across Europe, to the most famous image of Jesus, which was called the Veronica image, or sometimes called the Sudarium. I'm showing you a painting here in the middle by Robert Campin, or his workshop, painted about 70 years earlier than the Dürer self-portrait. And it shows us a saint named Veronica, who is associated with Christ's passion. She's not mentioned in the Bible, but beginning in the 6th or 7th century, apocryphal texts elaborating on the passion narrative begin to tell the story of a pious woman named Veronica, who, when she saw Christ carrying his cross on his way to his death, his execution, approached him and wiped his face with her handkerchief to clean the blood and the sweat and the dirt from his features, to give him momentary relief. And as a reward for her compassion, she got a miraculous likeness of Christ on her cloth. And that's what Campin does such an amazing job showing here. We've got this translucent cloth that Veronica holds up. Then features of the Christ's face have been miraculously transposed to that that cloth. This was a particular class of icon called an image not made by hands. It also served as a very powerful authorization for images of Christ, because if Christ had not wanted images of himself, he wouldn't have made an image of himself. So this was a justification for Christian icons and a justification for treating images as relics. And there were indulgences in this period where if you said a special prayer before this image, the Veronica image of Christ, you would receive time off from purgatory. On the left, I'm showing you a copy, unfortunately, of a painting that's now lost, but this is a faithful copy, probably a 15th century copy of a painting by Jan van Eyck, the great Flemish oil painter of the 1420s and 1530s, based in Bruges, who worked for Philip the Good of Burgundy. And what van Eyck has done here is imagined a contemporary portrait of Christ. In other words, a portrait of Christ that van Eyck might have painted had he seen Christ in person. And to make that as vivid as possible, he's used the Veronica likeness of Christ. Uh, the Veronica likeness of Christ is made up in a couple pronounced features. And so maybe what I'd ask you to do is to think here just about what the face here in the Campin shares with the face in the Van Eyck. And I think there are a couple things here we could notice. We could notice first of all, the pronounced symmetry, the absolute balance of the face gazing directly forwards at us. That long, very, very straight nose in the center of a fairly expressionless face. The eyebrows may be slightly raised. And then in a most pronounced way, the hair on either side dangling symmetrically on the shoulders here, or hanging from the head here, and then a beard in the center. Dürer has taken exactly that model as the basis of his own self-portrait here. So what we can absolutely say is that Dürer is modeling his self-portrait on the most famous image of Jesus. One of the ways we can tell this is deliberate is Dürer was actually quite proud of his long blonde hair. We have multiple self-portraits where he has long blonde hair. And here he's actually slightly darkened the appearance of his hair as it appears normally to make this comparison with Jesus all the clearer. And so maybe I'll pause here and ask if you have questions or suggestions about how you think about this, an artist modeling himself on Jesus and what that might have meant.
We do have one question right now, Eric, that might
Happy to take it.
on this. Anything symbolic about the self-portrait's hand positioning?
Excellent question. So we see as we look at this, and as Dürer looks back at us, that would be his proper right hand. So from his point of view, his right hand, very carefully feeling the beautiful fur on his collar. Probably not symbolic in terms of its exact gesture. Probably meant to recall in some ways, though, a blessing gesture that a figure like Christ would often make with his proper right hand. Some art historians have noted that since Dürer probably produced this image in a mirror and expects us to understand that he produced this by looking at himself in a mirror, what we see as his proper right hand would actually have been his proper left hand as he was producing the painting, so that it's actually his painting hand which is coming just under the frame, the image, truncated by this, so that in some sense he's concealed his painting hand from us. And just as the image of the Veronica, or the Veronica image of Christ, is an image not made by hands, some have seen a very subtle suggestion that this is an image not made by hands, because we don't see the painted hand that's making it.
We have two more questions.
Excellent.
You mentioned a point about purgatory. Could you repeat it, please?
Sure. So during the later Middle Ages, there was a belief in purgatory as a place that people would go if they didn't deserve immediate admission to heaven upon their death, but they didn't deserve eternal damnation in hell. And so purgatory was a place they went to purge themselves, hence the name purgatory, of their sins for a duration that was unknown. The church in the 14th and 15th centuries enabled people to perform certain acts, pious acts, that would shorten their term in purgatory. And that was they would say they had acquired an indulgence. And so if you said a prayer called the Hail, Holy Face in front of Veronica image, like this one by Campin, you would shorten your time in purgatory. This is a practice and a belief that comes under wide condemnation under Luther. It's one of the sparks of the Protestant Reformation. At the time Dürer is painting this self-portrait, Luther's critique has not emerged on the scene. Dürer in the 1520s will become a strong supporter of Luther, but at this point that critique isn't here.
Another question, what is the intention of trying to emulate himself as Christ?
Yeah, so that's the question that this portrait paints, and I think that this portrait poses. And one of the ways I think we can see Dürer's ambition, and I think we could imagine two or three things coming from this comparison, or maybe we could even say the use of this model more broadly. One of the things the use of this model is doing is comparing Dürer's portrait of himself, a painted portrait, and thus a unique object, to the most famous portrait of Christ. That portrait of Christ was also regarded as an especially accurate portrait of Christ because it was produced by miraculous means, not by human hands. So Dürer is also implying that his image might be equally accurate, that his talent might also be equally miraculous. Then we can think about Dürer as an artist, and that's the real reason I wanted to start with this today. An artist could compare themselves to Christ or to God because an artist brings new things into the world. An artist invents, an artist creates. And I think that is implicit in Dürer's self-portrait of himself modeled on a likeness of Christ, that he is claiming a certain agency and a certain creativity for artists. And as we'll see, that's one of the novel aspects of Dürer's self-conception, and one of the most innovative aspects and most influential aspects of his self-conception of his role as an artist. Other questions?
An extension of this one, Dürer's hand is pointing inward as if blessing himself. What might be the significance of this?
That's an excellent question, and I'll admit I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I don't know if I would read the gesture as blessing oneself. As I try to think of medieval images of blessing and Renaissance images of blessing, I can't come up with a parallel where the figure performing the blessing blesses themselves. In some ways, I think blessing always, as I'm imagining it, remembering it right now, always has a direct object that is outside the person doing the blessing. So blessing is something you do to someone else, not yourself. I do think there is the likelihood that the gesture is meant to echo gestures of blessing that would have been in authoritative images of Christ as the Savior. Other questions or comments?
There's a final comment. Perhaps this portrait is in the genre of portraits of people as famous or mythological personages.
Absolutely. That's a great observation. So starting in the 15th century, so the century that Dürer is born in, when we begin to get portraits where the goal of the artist making the portrait is a recognizable likeness of the person, which is really a novelty in the 15th century, you begin to have portraits inserted into historical scenes. So Charles VII, the King of France, is shown once as one of the magi in an adoration of the wise men. There is a Duchess of Guelders, Mary of Guelders, who's actually shown a portrait of herself, but with an angel greeting her, as if she is part of the Annunciation, receiving the greeting from the angel Mary, or the angel Gabriel. No one prior to Dürer had taken the fairly bold step of inserting their features into a portrait of Christ. Similarly, this is a picture that has no immediate progeny, a measure, I think, of Dürer's boldness. So let me segue now. So I'm using this in some ways, I hope, to get a sense of how seriously and ambitiously Dürer takes his role as artist and as inventor of things. Now I want to look at a couple prints and think about how that plays out in practice. So how he practices as an artist. It was, I will admit, hard for me to figure out which images to talk about, given the comparative limitations on time. And so I hope I've erred in some ways on the side of fewer images rather than more, so we can look at them in a bit more detail. I'm going to start with this print, which Dürer does in 1504 of Adam and Eve. And I'm showing you right now the impression that's in the Allen. Wherever possible in today's talk, I'll be using prints that are on display currently in the Allen. So again, if you enjoy the talk or interested in the talk, interested in the art, you have a chance to come and see the originals of these. This is a print that Dürer worked on very intensively for 2 years. By worked on, I mean a couple things. First of all, as in his self-portrait, there's the imperfect verb tense in the inscription here. Again, in Latin, Albertus Dürer Noricus of Nuremberg, Faci ebat, was making this. And then the date, 1504. He did studies of this for this print for probably 18 months or 2 years before finishing it. And if we look at some of those studies and what this print is based on, we get a great sense of his practice, especially in the early years of the 16th century. So first of all, the figures of Adam and Eve are based, maybe incongruously, on ancient sculpture. So the figure of Adam is based on a statue called the Apollo Belvedere. This is a Roman statue, probably of the 2nd century, that's thought to copy a Greek original of the 4th century. This sculpture had actually been excavated only, what are we at, 15 years prior to Dürer's print in 1489, and was a sensation among humanists and Renaissance artists. Dürer never went to Rome, so probably never saw this sculpture in person, but probably knew it from copies and certainly from prints. The figure of Eve is based on a sculpture in the Medici collection, which he also probably knew from prints, now called the Medici Venus, and we could date it roughly 0. So as with his self-portrait, where the imperfect tense was comparing him to someone like Phidias or someone like Apelles, here he's modeling his images on ancient sculpture. Unlike the self-portrait, and I should say that ancient sculpture is unlike the self-portrait in that the self-portrait was modeled on an ancient Christian image, this modeled on ancient pagan imagery. And it's notable to think about using Apollo as a model for Adam and Venus as a model for Eve. And I wonder if people have questions or speculations there that you could put in the Q&A. What might have motivated? Okay, so one of the things Dürer is doing as we think about this, this is the moment just before the fall. We see the serpent in the tree with an apple in its mouth. Eve is just plucking out. There is another apple here over in Eve's hand. So presumably she's got one that she's about to eat. She's got one that she's just about to hand to Adam. When they eat the fruit, sin will enter the world and they'll become mortal and they'll be in a fallen state. In this moment, though, they're still in paradise and their bodies are perfect. And one of the things Dürer is doing here is using this print, the Adam and Eve of 1504, as an exercise in ideal human proportion. And what does the ideal, beautiful body looks like? So his subject matter for the ideal body is coming from classical antiquity, or excuse me, is coming from the Bible, from paradise, from Christian creation. But the models for those perfect bodies are coming from ancient sculpture, as is in keeping with his role very much as a self-conscious Renaissance artist. Thinking about proportion, we also have these drawings that he did leading up to the Adam and Eve. So these two studies of the Eve, I could have shown you more of the Adam. I could have shown you studies of the Adam and Eve together. As you look at the oval drawn here around Eve's pointing finger, as you look here at the squares and rectangles, almost a grid system that Dürer has both imposed on the figure and allowed the figure to generate, there's a really good sense from these preparatory drawings that Dürer is working not just on the rendering of a naked female body, but the proportions of a female body. So he's informed both by classical sculpture and by trying to come up with a proportional scheme that will make the bodies he depicts ideal and beautiful. And Dürer is consistently invested in proportion and geometry throughout his entire career. This is giving us, in some sense, an early sample of it. And then he's also invested in study from life. So this, again, is a preparatory sheet for the Adam and Eve of 1504. This is a drawing potentially he does in 1503 or maybe even early 1504. And what we're getting here are a couple poses for Adam's arm and 4 poses actually for Adam's hand, and also rough draft of the rocky outcropping we're seeing up in the upper right corner of the print. And I just again ask if you've got questions or observations about what an artist going through this kind of process is doing, what this process tells us. So looking at ancient sculpture, doing proportional studies of bodies, then doing these repeated figure studies of a single motif, an extended arm. How does this strike you?
We have a couple of responses.
Excellent.
One is Dürer's Eve seems more immature and less sexy than Venus. Was that intentional?
That's an excellent question. And one of the things that my class has talked about as well. So I'm very grateful for that question. I think that's probably a fair point. The Eve and the Venus, the Medici Venus is called a Venus of modesty, where on the one hand, she's attempting to cover up her nakedness, while in some ways by covering it up, revealing it, making it more eroticized, more voyeuristic on our part. Dürer's Eve stands more frankly there. One of the things that my students asked about and observed that we talked about in class was the fact that even though this is before the fall, even though Adam and Eve feel no shame yet, and that might also speak to the non-erotic appearance of Eve's body, their genitals are still covered by leaves. The leaf springing conveniently from the branch of the apple that Eve picks. Apparently, it was an aggressive pick of the fruit that brought this branch with it. The branch here springing still from this tree covers Adam's genitals. And I think what we can see here, this is something my students, I think, led me to this in the discussion, was that while Adam and Eve are not yet in a fallen state, Dürer conceives of himself and the viewers of this print as being in a fallen state. So Adam and Eve have no need to be ashamed of their nudity. But we have reason to fear our own voyeurism or erotic interest in their nudity. And so Dürer, in some sense, is protecting us, not Adam and Eve, by the addition of those leaves.
Okay. Another question is, at that time, was talent acknowledged as God-given? How much is God-given? How much involved individual talent and training? Did Dürer change this conception?
Excellent question. I almost think I could have planted that question. That's in some ways one of the whole themes of this talk. So thank you very much for that. Dürer is a strong believer in God-given talent, and a strong believer in the role God-given talent plays in making some artists better than other artists. In the 1520s, he writes 2 books, training books for artists. And one of them has a kind of lengthy reflection where he breaks off the sort of mundane, this is how you draw a circle, this is how you draw a spiral, this is how you draw a sphere, and reflects on art making. And one of the things he says there is that, and it's kind of twofold, some artists are given by God more talent than other artists, and that can make something modest they do, a little drawing, a little bit of carving in a wood block that they do in the space of an hour, more impressive than the work of a less gifted artist working for a year on an enormous work. It's one of the first verbalizations of the idea that a modest in scale work by a great artist is better than a large or expensive piece by a not so great artist. And Dürer believes absolutely that that gift is God given. And then at the same time, he believes you have to work really hard to realize the promise of that gift. And that's, I think, one of the things we can take, especially from this sheet of drawings. Dürer, by the time he did this print, had been working as a professional artist for a decade. Dürer had done dozens of figures in drawing and in prints of naked men and women by the time he did this print. And yet he still regards it as necessary to do 3 separate drawings here of Adam's hand holding the apple. He does one drawing for Adam's hand holding here a staff. Here we could even I think, see the model's hand in his studio holding the staff, what's going to become the branch here. You can imagine the model in his studio being frustrated by having to hold this pose for so long. It's not just the artist who has to do a lot of work, it's the person modeling for them. So Dürer very much believes talent is God-given, but that it has to be worked to be realized.
Here's a question. Just wondered if the Spanish painter Zurbarán studied Dürer. Zurbarán's detail and richness, especially in his painting Agnus Dei, seems to parallel Dürer.
That's a wonderful question. I'll use what I tell my students, the 3 most beautiful words in the English language. I don't know exactly. It would make perfect sense to me that Zurbarán had seen Dürer. One of the things we haven't really talked about yet is the fact that Dürer works both as a painter and a printmaker, and really more as a printmaker after 1500. And by working in prints, he was able to disseminate his works across Europe and make them actually quite affordable. So I have no question at all that Zurbarán would have seen Dürer prints. What I don't know is precisely how much impact they would have had on him.
Okay. A question about the print here. The base of the tree of knowledge of good and evil has a very unusual shape. Did Dürer paint from nature?
Excellent question. So Dürer definitely paints from nature, and we've got some tree studies he does. I don't know that we have a tree study for this particular print. We do have studies of a cat, very like this cat. We have a study of a bunny, very like this bunny. So we've got to imagine absolutely a great deal of drawing feeding into this, not just of the model, but also of nature. And actually that serves as a good segue, this watercolor he does, 1497. And here I want us to keep thinking about how Dürer works as an artist, in some sense as the necessary complement to that divine gift that he believes can separate an artist from others. In that same treatise from the late 1520s, where he says a gifted artist will be able to do a small thing and make it more impressive than a large thing by a modest artist, he also says it's essential that artists draw every day and that they constantly stock their mind with motifs. One of the things we can see with the study of these arms here for Adam is not just preparation for the Adam and Eve print, but also Dürer stocking his mind about how to render a chest, how to render shadow, how to render a clenched hand, how to render the surface of an apple in a few lines. He does that in particular in ways that seem quite contemporary and very winning to us with some of his surviving watercolors. So here I'm showing you a watercolor of a pond house he does in 1497, probably a fisherman's hut, often a pond outside Nuremberg, his hometown. And this, we've got to imagine absolutely Dürer on the motif, out with a set of watercolors, out with sheets of paper, doing a fairly quick, very charismatic, I think, drawing of a fairly modest scene with this boat in the foreground and a kind of muddy, marshy shore, and this little fisherman's hut in the distance. When Dürer did this study, he probably didn't have a goal for it. In other words, it's probably not a preparatory study. He's here feeding his brain with motifs, and this is something he does repeatedly with drawings. But within a year of doing this watercolor of the pond house, The motif shows up in the background of this Madonna. This is called the Madonna with the monkey because of the monkey prominent in the foreground here. Dürer does dozens of images of the Madonna and Child, and so they typically get named for whatever is unusual about them. This is the only one he does with a monkey, so we call this the Madonna with the monkey. I should note that virtually all of the prints Dürer does were untitled in his day. He doesn't assign them titles. It was collectors in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century who began to title them. And what we see Dürer doing here is taking a fairly traditional iconography of the Madonna and Child, Mary and Jesus, so seated on a grassy bench, and then adding in the background a motif that he had done within the last year or so from the watercolors. And this gives us a really good idea of how Dürer is constantly drawing things around him and then finding occasions to deploy those things he'd drawn. And that kind of daily practice of drawing as a way to feed your toolbox, your arsenal of images and motifs is something Dürer also emphasizes. He says that the artist who does this will have a well-stocked brain that they can draw on inexhaustibly, and that they actually won't be able to realize all of their ideas because this well-stocked arsenal in their brain will give them more ideas than they have time to actually finish. Let's just look at a couple others of his drawings. In 1520, 1521, he goes on a lengthy trip to the Low Countries, spending most of his time in Antwerp. And he does one day, sitting on the harbor of Antwerp, this fairly rapid line drawing. Rapid, but also quite precise. And I think we can see that he's worked intensively on the architecture here. Very, very crisp. Tempting to ask maybe if he used a straight edge, although I think Dürer by this point probably wouldn't need to use a straight edge. He's also got very pronounced orthogonal lines in banks of the harbor. And the figures are much more quickly painted, as if Dürer is maybe just at the having laid in the architecture very firmly, has one last glance and adds a couple figures. The same trip, he had the chance to see a walrus, a dead walrus, and does this drawing with an inscription. This animal of those parts whose head I have drawn here was caught in the Netherlands Sea and was 12 Brabant ells long with 4 feet. And what's notable about these drawings, again, is Dürer is executing them without a purpose to begin with. So if I went back here, this is a drawing with a purpose. He knows he's working on the Adam and Eve, and he's trying to get the pose right and the hand right. This was a drawing without a particular outlet in mind, a particular outcome in mind that he's doing to stock his brain with motifs. Similarly, when he's in Antwerp, he's not planning a painting of Antwerp. He's not planning a print of Antwerp. He never did a print of Antwerp or a painting of it. Instead, he's like, that's a good motif, and I should draw it. In a different city, in the small port town, he actually said, this city is good to draw, which is a remarkable written observation, that he found the city enjoyable to draw. And there, I think we could imagine a place where he could stock his brain with motifs that could feed his imagination or feed his invention. Similarly, as far as we know, he never did a print or a painting that showed a walrus, but he recognized the occasion of seeing this strange creature that he'd probably heard of but never seen. And so he wanted to get a drawing of it just in case it might come in useful later. It also becomes something of a snapshot for himself of the sights he saw on this trip. We might even think about Dürer turning himself into able to use his talent to do what we would now do with a camera if we were traveling as a tourist. Questions here, having talked about his drawings and the way he uses them.
There is one question about the drawings. Is there a particular significance to the bird that Christ is holding?
Oh, that's an excellent question. There's often a bird that shows up in Christ's hand. Sometimes the bird can be taken as a reference to a soul. I don't think in this particular case there's any direct significance, though.
Okay. Someone asks, what tools and materials did he use?
Excellent question. So Dürer is, again, it's notable that he's raised by a goldsmith. So when he turned to printmaking, he would have been used to working on metal surfaces. The image that you're seeing here, the Madonna with the monkey, is an engraving. So that means he's cut the lines that are going to be printed into a copper plate. He then inks the plate, and the lines that he's cut with the burin into the plate catch the ink. He wipes the plate clean so that only the engraved lines are holding the ink, and then he prints it on paper. On the left, he's working with watercolors, where the binder for the pigments is gouache or gum arabic, also on paper. He also works, and we'll see them in a bit, in woodcut. Drawing here is in pen and ink, and he also works in etchings and in dry point, although I'm not showing any of those today.
Okay. There's another question about the Adam and Eve print, if you
Sure.
want to take that. How would you interpret the gazes of Adam and Eve in terms of the story?
Excellent question, and I'm always cautious about trusting whether we can read the gaze of a person in a two-dimensional image. So I try in some ways to be very careful in reading gazes. My sense of Eve's gaze generally is that her head is tilted slightly downwards, which to me makes sense as looking towards the serpent depositing that apple in her hand, whereas Adam seems to me to be gazing directly towards Eve and sort of his gaze overshooting serpent. But I also think Dürer is being careful in not giving us, I think, particularly prominent gazes. In other words, I don't know if I'd want to read too much of a narrative from the direction of their heads.
Someone would like you to talk about the monkey a little bit in that particular piece.
Yeah,
Yes.
so the monkey could have a couple different roles. The monkey is often seen as a lesser human. So the monkey can be a parodic element. The monkey is also often cast as a representation of sinful humanity in its fallen state. And so here, the fact that the monkey occurs next to the recently born Savior who will redeem people from their sin could come into play. I think also the fact that this monkey is chained suggests that the monkey, as a sinful being, has now had some restraints imposed upon itself in a way that would make sense of its presence with Christ and Mary here.
Okay. Also about this print, the Quran has a story of Christ breathing life into a dead bird when he was a child. And could this be a reference?
Excellent question. I think it absolutely could be. I'd be very curious about that. I'd love the citation. Whoever that was, if they could email me the citation for the Quran. The presence of a bird in Christ's hands is fairly prominent in Christian art, at least going back to the 13th century, though. The earliest translation of the Quran into Latin is a 12th century translation. Just how familiar Dürer might have been and his audience might have been with the Quran. Very interesting question. Again, I may have to say I don't know, but I will look into it. Thank you very much.
Someone asks whether in the Adam and Eve drawing, is there any significance to the fact that the models for this drawing are pagan and yet the story being depicted is Christian?
Yeah, there I think the significance is maybe twofold. First of all, we know that Dürer, and I'd say this, it speaks to this artistically and then also religiously. And one of the things we always need to do with artists is recognize, with Dürer, is recognize he is both emphatically an artist and emphatically a Christian. So we should always be thinking about how his artistry complements his Christianity and vice versa. So it may seem incongruous that Adam is modeled on Apollo and Eve modeled on Venus. Dürer, though, is looking for a way to show their bodies as perfect because their bodies are God's creation, and this is before their bodies have been weakened by sin. And for Dürer as a Renaissance artist in the early 16th century, the most beautiful depictions of bodies came from classical art, ancient Roman art. And so as he attempts to ennoble Adam and Eve by their beauty, those models are the ones that are most persuasive to him, despite what might be seen as their antithetical religious content. The other thing that's worth noting, and this is in terms of Dürer's artistry, Dürer very much meant the Adam and Eve in 1504 as not only a religious image of humanity's parents before the fall, but also in some ways as a manifesto or a demonstration piece of what ideal human beauty looked like, independent of religious content. And we know he actually did multiple studies and even one print of Apollo, and then seems to have decided that if he wanted this print to have a broad audience, so many people would see his depiction of ideal beauty, Adam and Eve were more familiar than Apollo and Venus, and so made a better subject matter for getting this print out into the world where it could persuade people of Dürer's ability to create the perfect bodies. Always an eye on his audience and what his audience would recognize.
A final comment. You seem to suggest that the arm studies are from life. Surely he's not working from nude female models?
Excellent question. I think it's quite possible he would have worked from a nude female model at some point. So I don't think we should think that's impossible. But it's much more likely, as Michelangelo did, that for male and female figures, he's drawing on male models. He was married to his wife, Agnes. He does do a large number, well, not a large number. He does in the 1490s a significant number of subjects that require female, that depict naked women. And there, I think it quite likely that if not having a woman pose for him, those images are based on familiarity with naked women, to phrase that very carefully.
Okay. Someone wants to refer back to the self-portrait. Who would have seen it, and how was it presented to the public?
Excellent question. So we have every reason to believe that after painting this remains in Dürer's house, in his possession. So if you visited his house, which was also his workshop, you might have seen it. We don't know anything about how the interior of that house was arranged, although I'll show you the house in a moment. After his death in 1528, the painting probably goes to the Nuremberg City Hall. Dürer was one of Nuremberg's most famous citizens, one of its favorite sons, one of its attractions in some ways. Nuremberg took pride in Dürer, as we'll see. And so the painting seems to have been displayed there. Nuremberg had something of a painting collection in its city hall. So if you were a tourist visiting Nuremberg, perhaps in town for the annual relic fair after Dürer's death, you might have been able to see it in the city hall. That also speaks to an excellent question. As we think about Dürer, his paintings will have a more limited audience. His prints will have a very, very broad audience, and he's aware of that distinction. The paintings will also, and we'll talk about this when we get to him as an entrepreneur, bring him more money for an individual painting than an individual print, but the painting will cost him time in a way that the print won't.
Okay, I think we're done for
All
the
right,
moment.
thank you so much for the questions and observations. I really appreciate it. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of Dürer's artistry and his self-conception of as an artist is a little bit about his writing. Starting already in the 15 teens, he had begun to work on a manual for artists. He's working on it very actively in the mid-1520s, and then he puts it aside. He was writing a book on human proportion, the 4 books on human proportion. He puts it aside to write a treatise on measurement. And I'm showing you the final opening of that book here, which was published in 1525 in Nuremberg. And I think what's really notable here, that the reason I picked this opening, is Dürer is writing a book on geometry. And at the end, it's also a book about the correct rendering of 3-dimensional forms on 2-dimensional surfaces. So perspective rendering. And Dürer had actually invented devices as early as 1514 to make it easier for people to learn how to render three-dimensional forms on a two-dimensional surface. So what we're seeing here, this is the left of this page, I'm showing it a little bit blown up here, is an artist standing at this device that Dürer had invented, drawing a man posed on this chair. And the device has this frame here, which has a pane of glass, so it's transparent. The artist has a brush in hand and a little bit of ink standing on the stand here. And then he's got this device, which is showing him where he needs to hold his eye. So he has a completely consistent, regular, uniform, unchanging gaze on the man he's portraying through this pane of glass. So what this device enables him to do is trace the man's likeness that he sees on the pane of glass, and thus create a three-dimensional rendering of the man on the two-dimensional surface. Dürer was not actually satisfied here with this 1525 edition. So in the last 3 years of his life, he kept working towards a second edition, which was published 10 years after his death in 1538. That alone gives us some sense of his reputation and the care that his family had. They managed to get 10 years after his death, a second edition of his writings issued. In this second edition, we have a still more vivid example of a perspectival device. So first, this was Dürer's study, drawing for how he wanted the print to look. And then reversed in the print, we have the finished version from the 1538 edition of this treatise on measurement. We have here a reclining naked woman. Again, so this suggests that the idea of studying from a naked female model was absolutely plausible to Dürer and his audience, although there may be something meant to be a little bit titillating for the person using this, presumably the male audience using this book. The artist is looking through a gridded system here, a panel, or a grid set up on a translucent panel, or potentially even just a grid looking through the empty frame. There's an equivalent grid, a scaled sheet in front of the artist. The artist is drawing the contours they're seeing through this grid. And then once again, in this case, we have an obelisk, which tells the artist where they have to hold their eye regularly to make sure that they're getting exactly the same glimpse or glance at the woman through this grid, so they can transfer her exactly to this three-dimensional model. This tells us, again, a couple important things about Dürer as an artist. One of his definitions of successful art making is what he believed to be realism. And in this case in particular, the realistic rendering of a three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. So Dürer is not a sculptor making three-dimensional objects. He is a draftsman, he is a painter, and he is a printmaker. So he's dealing with the two-dimensional representation of three-dimensional forms and trying to make that as plausible as possible. And for Dürer, like most artists in the 15th and 16th century, the definition of perspective had been codified by Brunelleschi in the Florence and then written about by Alberti. So Dürer absolutely buys into linear perspective. The other thing that's notable about this whole project is, while Dürer believed God-given talent mattered, he also believed artists could practice skills. And even potentially an artist who didn't have a God-given talent could become a skilled artist. And if you had a God-given talent, you could develop the skills God had given you, the talent God had given you, by following a set of instructions and a set of rules. So it wasn't enough just to have that divinely given talent. You had to work at it, and you had to follow certain rules. And so Dürer writes these books very much about these rules. And these become almost, we could say, a kind of valedictory effort published in the last 3 years of his life. With that, I'd like to pivot from focusing on the artistry to thinking about how Dürer made a living, how he managed to make this artistry economically viable, and in the end, absolutely economically profitable. And one of the things I'd note, just maybe even making the pivot, is that if we're here, we need to take it really seriously that Dürer wrote a book and illustrated that book. Dürer is, in addition to being a painter and a draftsman and a printmaker, a publisher. He was fortunate in that sense to live in Nuremberg because Nuremberg was a center of publishing. I'm showing you here an image of Nuremberg that was made in 1493, at which point Dürer is 21. This is from the book commonly called the Nuremberg Chronicle. Its actual title is the Book of Chronicles, written by Hartmann Schadel. It's a world history going back to Adam and Eve and coming up to the present. It has two illustrators, Michael Wohlgemuth and Willem Pledenwerf. Wohlgemuth was actually Dürer's painting instructor, his apprentice master, when he decided to leave his father's studio, his father's workshop, and enter a painter's studio. Wohlgemuth became his master, and it's possible that Dürer contributed some images to the Nuremberg Chronicle, published in 1493, which has a vast scheme of illustration. And then notably, the Book of Chronicles was published by this man, Anton Koberger, who was Dürer's godfather. So Albrecht Dürer the Elder made a beautiful selection for his son's godfather in having his godfather be Nuremberg's leading publisher. And Koberger was a publisher from the 1470s in Nuremberg into the 15 teens, so for most of Dürer's lifetime. And that means Dürer is not just embedded in the world of goldsmiths and embedded in the world of painters like Wohlgemuth. He's embedded in the world of publishers and takes advantage of that embeddedness. We see that with one of his most famous works, which he publishes in 1498, The Apocalypse, or The Apocalypse in Pictures, as it's more properly known. This was the first book in Europe to be conceived of and published entirely by an artist. So, for example, if we go back to the Nuremberg Chronicle, as I said, it's got lots and lots of pictures, but it's Hartmann Schadel and Koberger together who conceive of the book, and they hire a Wohlgemuth and Pledenwerf to do the pictures for it. Dürer, on the other hand, conceives of the Apocalypse himself, borrows type from his godfather, Koberger, so that he can publish the book, potentially borrows his godfather's presses as well, so that he can publish the book. But this is entirely a production of Dürer's. I'm showing you an image on the left from Williams College, because Williams College is fortunate enough to have the book in its original condition. Almost all of these books from 1498 have been cut up for their prints. And so the prints now circulate very widely. Last Friday at Sotheby's, a set of 15 prints was sold, but they weren't sold in the book. Similarly, at Heritage Auction House last Friday, a single print, The Four Horsemen, was for sale, cut from the book. But we need to remember that when Dürer publishes this, it's a book. It's also really important to note that when he publishes this, one, it's got the Latin text of the Book of Revelation, but that the text which the picture illustrates is actually on the opposite side of the page. So here in Williams' copy, I'm showing you the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And I'm showing you here impression of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse that's in the Cleveland Museum of Art. To read the text that goes with this image, you would need to flip this page and read it on the back. So Dürer, as you're working your way through this book, is giving you an enormous image on its own, and then you turn the page to read the text that the image illustrates. So we can tell very much this is a book with text and images that's put together by an image producer, and he really wants the images to take priority over the text. Whereas in previous schemes, if someone was publishing a book of Revelation, they would have juxtaposed on the same opening the text on one page and then the illustration of that text on the facing page. If we look at the impression that we have in the Allen from this, we have the section where John, the evangelist John, the author of the Book of Revelation, is commanded to eat a book. Columbia University also has a copy of this. So I'm showing you how ours would have appeared in the book originally. This from the 1511 edition. In 1498, I should have said, Dürer prints an edition in German and an edition in Latin. That's part of his entrepreneurship. He knows that the German edition can sell broadly in Germany, but not outside Germany, whereas the Latin edition will be restricted to people who read Latin, but they're going to be scattered across Europe. So he's trying to match both markets, hit both markets. In 1511, he publishes a second edition, now only in Latin. And ours comes from the Latin edition. I would urge you to go to the Allen to see it. If you look very closely, we can almost see it here, I think, but if you get in person with this print upstairs, you'll be able to see text from the opposite side of this page, not bleeding through, but stamped through so that we can still make it out to some degree. It's useful just to note briefly the challenge of illustrating this text to get a sense of Dürer's artistry here. I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven. So this is the angel, clothed with a cloud. So he shows this angel, mostly cloud, a rainbow on his head. We have the rainbow here, and his face is the sun, this gleaming face, and his feet as pillars of fire. Dürer giving us absolutely a verbatim illustration. What would it look like if your feet were pillars of fire? So we have here two pillars that are on fire. And he had in his hand a little book open. And he set his right foot upon the sea. There's his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot upon the earth. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Go and take the book that is open from the hand of the angel." And I went to the angel, saying unto him that he should give me the book. And he said, "Take the book and eat it up, and it shall make thy belly bitter, but in thy mouth it shall be sweet as honey." And I took the book from the hand of the angel and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey. And when I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. What Dürer is doing here in a genuinely remarkable way is, first of all, combining several narrative moments. The angel appears, he hears a voice, the angel tells him to do things, he asks for the book, all of that condensed into one. And then taking the absolutely visionary language of the book of Revelation, where you can have a figure with pillars of fire, clothed in clouds, rainbow on his head, and visualizing for that in an absolutely plausible three-dimensional way. This is the kind of image making that runs throughout this book that made Dürer's reputation and made him in 1498, when this book was published, celebrated across Europe, where the book was read. We also know that in 1497, and this speaks to his entrepreneurship, just before this book was about to be finished, he hired 3 different men to travel around Europe selling his prints and the apocalypse. So not only is he publishing his own book under his own entire initiative, he's also hiring people to take care of the distribution of it, absolutely acting as a publisher in every sense of the term. And because of that, also able to secure all the revenue from its sales. Are there questions or comments here?
There is a question about the book. How many copies of the book did Dürer originally publish? Was there a second printing or later posthumous versions?
That's an excellent question. So very rough guess is that for the German edition and the Latin edition of 1498, potentially 200 to 300 copies of each, so not in the thousands. Some of those might have been cut up almost instantly by print collectors. In 1511, he publishes a second edition, now in Latin only. And there, again, we probably want to think maybe between 400 and 500 copies. These are woodcuts, not engravings. And woodcuts can be printed sometimes into the thousands. But to do the entire book, I think we've got to imagine, say, 1,000 at the max seems most plausible. In terms of posthumous copies, there are not, as far as I know, posthumous copies from Dürer's blocks of the book. The blocks probably survived into later into the 1500s and might well have been run off in individual prints after Dürer's death. Whereas the printed book had the typeset in 1498 and then in 1511. And then the glory of movable type is that after you'd printed all the ones you wanted to print, you move the type and use it for something else. So he didn't print anything after any of these after 1511.
Another question is, we've seen black on white / cream prints. Did he do any prints in color?
Excellent question. He does not do prints in color. And Erasmus, the great humanist after Conrad Keltis, who's also a supporter and admirer of Dürer, actually comments that Dürer's prints are so good in black and white that Erasmus says it would be insulting to color them. They would be made lesser by being colored. Although we do know of collectors in the 16th century in Dürer's lifetime who, after they acquired Dürer's prints, would have them hand-colored by other artists. As far as we know, Dürer never did that himself, and he never refers to that.
A comment here. There are 2 copies of the book in the print here, one in hand and one on the ground behind. Does this reflect or emphasize the importance of the book, his book? Or what interpretation do you give these 2 books that are present in this print?
Excellent question. So the book that we see on the ground that lies abandoned by John is actually referred to in verses 4 through 7, which I've excised from this quote for the sake of getting to the more visionary aspects. As the angel appeared, John has been writing the revelations he's seen, and he's told actually to put the book down so that he can interact with the angel and eat the book that the angel is giving to him. So the book that he's put down is where moments before he was transcribing the visions that he's having, and he'd been expressly told to put that down. So this becomes also a very careful illustration of the text that Dürer is picturing here. Excellent question, excellent observation.
No other questions.
All right. So with thinking then in 1511, that's the year for the second edition of the Apocalypse, Dürer actually publishes multiple books in that year. This is in some ways his high point as a publisher. And they let us see something also about his entrepreneurship. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through the books to get towards their entrepreneurial aspect. So one of the books he publishes is called The Large Passion. It is a picture cycle of Christ's Passion illustrated with woodcuts, with text by a Benedictine monk named Benedict Caledonius, a devotional text. We have one print from this book, cut out probably in the 18th or 19th century, showing the betrayal of Christ. You see Judas here kissing Christ. What's notable here in terms of Dürer's entrepreneurship is, as I said, this book comes out in 1511. If you look carefully in the sky of our print, the date is 1510. Dürer had been actually working towards this book for several years. Some of the prints that appear in the book of 1511, he'd made in 1504 or 1505. And what he was doing as he made these prints was issuing them separately as he worked on the whole project. So in 1510, you might have bought this print independently. In 1511, you could have bought it in the book as a whole. And the student in my class, I think in a really savvy way, said this is a little bit like an artist, a musician who knows they're working on an album and they're releasing singles along the way. And the singles are doing 2 things. One, they're getting some cash flow. So Dürer doesn't have to wait to begin to profit from this until the book is done. He can profit from selling the prints individually. Similarly, like a single for a musician, the issuing of these prints in 1504, 1510, as in this one, gave his audience a sense that the book was on its way, gave them in some sense a sample or an appetizer, and so helped to build a market for the book when it was eventually published. That's a sign of his market savvy. One of the things every printer had to do, whether a publisher or a maker of independent prints, and remember Dürer is both, is they were free from the demands of a patron. There wasn't someone breathing down their neck, when is my painting going to be ready, as we're going to see in a moment. But they had to anticipate what an audience would want, what would sell. So they have to have, if they're going to be successful, as Dürer is, a savvy understanding of what the market is after, and how they might even create a market. Dürer also publishes in 1511 A Life of the Virgin, which shows a full cycle of the life of the Virgin. We have one print from this book in the Allen that's currently on display. This is Joachim, Mary's father, receiving news from an angel that Joachim and Anna will have a child after having lived for a long time childless and having thought that they were barren. What I really want to focus on, though, is the last page, and not even the image so much, which shows the glorification of Mary and the Christ child surrounded by saints and angels. These words down at the bottom, which tell us a lot about how Dürer understood the market and the dangers of the market. And this is going to bring us back to his sense of himself as an artist. The words here, very decoratively arranged at the end of this book, are Dürer's caution against copyists, that is, those who would copy his images. They say, "Beware, you highway robber and thief of other men's labor and invention. Take heed that you do not lay rash hands on these our works. For be it known that the most glorious emperor of the Romans, Maximilian, has granted us a privilege, lest anyone dare print these images from forged blocks or sell such prints within the borders of the empire. For if in contempt of this or out of greed for money you make yourself culpable in such a way, you may reckon with confiscation of your goods and should realize that you have put yourself in the gravest peril." Dürer is doing something quite notable here. As you read this, I think probably the best comparison, contemporary comparison we would have for this is copyright. He's attempting to protect his works from being copied. Now, Dürer in 1511, Europe in 1511, doesn't have a notion of copyright, but he does have a notion that he's instrumental in developing, that he has a connection to these images that other artists don't have, and that it would be wrong of them, he claims, if they were to copy them. And he is trying to prevent that by getting a privilege, which is a legal decree from the Emperor Maximilian, who at this point is besotted with Dürer's art and a great supporter of his art. So Maximilian has given Dürer a privilege, which he can add to these books, which says no one is allowed to copy them. This was, as I said, we could call it the late 15th, early 16th century anticipation of what we do with copyright now. And there are a couple things, one major thing I want you to think about here as we begin to bring this to a close about Dürer as an artist and entrepreneur. Dürer is angered by those who would steal labor and invention. So I want you to keep those two terms in mind, labor and invention. That's what Dürer is trying to protect, his own labor and his own invention. So let's look at a case where Dürer would have felt that labor and invention had been stolen by a thief or robber. This is an image of Dürer on the left from the Life of the Virgin. This shows the presentation in the temple, where Mary is bringing Christ to the temple. Joseph is coming with her. Christ is in the arms of the high priest Simeon, from the 1511 Life of the Virgin, with Dürer's monogram, which is one of the ways he marks virtually all of his prints, even within a book. So we know this is a book published by Dürer. Every print still has the monogram in it, probably because Dürer recognizes some people are going to cut these up quickly. And so he wants his monogram to travel on each print, not just at the title page or the end page. On the right, we have an incredibly exact copy, although going from woodcut to engraving, an Italian artist named Marcantonio Raimondi, who copied Dürer quite frequently, going back to the 1490s. This is the kind of copying that Dürer is upset by. And I want us to think, first of all, how Raimondi might have justified it. As I said, there is not yet a clear-cut notion of copyright, and there is not yet a clear-cut notion of intellectual property, What Dürer wants to protect is his labor and invention. Raimondi, using that term labor, could probably have claimed the labor on my print is mine. I'm the one who procured the copper plate. I'm the one who transferred the design to the copper plate and did all the work of incising it with the burin. I'm the one who supplied the paper and the ink and ran it through the press. So Raimondi could say, I'm entitled to make this print because I did all the work on it. There are two aspects of Dürer's labor and invention that he would have replied with. And invention is uppermost. Invention is the novel aspect. Dürer might have credited, he would have had to credit Raimondi with doing the manual labor of executing this print, the material labor of executing this print. But Dürer would have said, what you have engraved on your plate and printed is an image that I invented with my well-stocked brain and my God-given talent for making new, striking images. So the labor and the invention that Dürer is talking about is not the manual labor, or not only the manual labor of making the object, it's also the labor of the idea and the brain, the ingenuity that came up with the idea. That's what Dürer is attempting to protect with privilege. And that's what makes him new. He doesn't have the language of intellectual property. He doesn't even have the language quite yet of imagination, a term that he actually avoids. So it's more that matter of ingenuity and talent and invention that he's trying to protect with this privilege. This was not the first time Raimondi had copied Dürer. One of the glories of the Allens collection is that we can see this up close and personal. So on the left, I'm showing you Dürer, a couple menaced by death from the 1490s, the late 1490s. And excuse me, on the right. And on the left, I'm showing you Marc-Antonio Raimondi's copy of the print. And you can tell that he just transferred Dürer's design to a new plate. So when he printed it, it was reversed. Skeleton on the right in the Dürer, skeleton on the left in the Raimondi. Other than that, he's copied everything, including Dürer's monogram down here. We can tell how successful Dürer was, at least within Nuremberg and the empire. In some ways, this is a test case. He's both successful and unsuccessful in protecting his privilege. In 1512, now unknown artist shows up in Nuremberg. And we can imagine, I'm using the Raimondi copy here as an example. This isn't the exact work that was being discussed in 1512 in Nuremberg. But we have in the minutes of the Nuremberg City Council this account from 1512. There's a stranger selling prints below the town hall, and among them a number that bear Albrecht Dürer's monogram, which has been fraudulently copied. He shall be obliged to remove the same sign from all of them and to cease selling them here. Else, should he defy this, all these sheets shall be confiscated as forgeries and handed over to the council. So effectively, what happened in Nuremberg in 1512 is an artist has apparently come into town. He's a stranger. He's not from here. He set up a stall. This itself is interesting. By the town hall, selling prints. And some of the prints have Dürer's monogram on them. But Dürer didn't make those prints. And now the city council, and Dürer was a member of the greater city council, is attempting to protect Dürer from these as copies. The situation is similar to what was happening in the 1490s when Raimondi was copying this Dürer composition right down to the monogram. And what they're saying is, these are forgeries. This is one of the earliest cases where we have a copy of another artist referred to as a forgery. And the council is trying to protect Dürer's monogram. The implication is that if this stranger takes Dürer's monogram off the prints, he'll be allowed to sell them. But the implication there also is that it's Dürer's monogram that makes them valuable, which is why the artist has added them, this unknown stranger artist. This gives us this desire to protect his work from copyists on the open market of printmaking in particular, gives us a sense, I think, of how Dürer blended artistry and entrepreneurship. The justification for projecting his works as his comes from his notion of artistry and what makes his images powerful, unique, and his. And then the attempt to protect it is the sign of his market savvy and his entrepreneurship, that he knows these copies will cut into his revenue, and he doesn't want that to happen. And then finally, I think this city council decision of 1512 shows us he'd persuaded others of this, at least in his hometown. And now the city council is attempting to protect Dürer's work as Dürer himself was protecting it. So I think that makes this an effective place to conclude today's talk. I'm happy to take questions or observations.
There are none since I last spoke. So I think we are done for this particular session. Thank you so much, Erik. I've learned a lot.
Thank you. A real pleasure. Thank you all for joining us.